think we can get going here. Thanks everybody for attending our next session for the 2024 Preservation Delaware Annual Conference. My name is Kara Smith. I'm the co-chair of the Education Committee and on the Board of Directors for Preservation Delaware. So thank you for attending. Our next session here is presented by the National Park Service representatives Taylor Pearlstein and Lilith Guzman. And the title of our session here is Be Prepared, Disaster Planning and Recovery with the Historic Preservation Fund. Before we get started, I just want to make a couple of notes. Thank you to our 2024 conference sponsors. Our full list of sponsors can be found on our annual conference webpage. All attendants are going to be muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. We'll take questions at the end of the presentation and review them. You can use the chat box if you need to get in touch with us or you're having technical difficulties. You can also check out the resources tab at the bottom of your screen. There we'll have speaker bios and other conference documents. And just so you know, this workshop is being recorded and it will be available in a few weeks on the Preservation Delaware's YouTube channel. Lastly, if you're not a member of PDI already, please consider joining or donating so we can keep putting on great sessions like this. So now to introduce our speakers, we have Taylor Pearlstein, who's a grant management specialist with the National Park Service's State, Tribal, Locals, Plans, and Grants Division. She serves as the primary point of contact for NPS's Emergency Supplemental Historic Preservation Fund, or ESHPF, and their grant program. And this program provides grants to state and tribal historic preservation offices for disaster recovery of cultural and historic resources. She's currently managing grants for historic resources impacted by hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, as well as hurricanes Florence, Michael, and Typhoon Yutu. Taylor received her bachelor's degree in art conservation from the University of Delaware and with a focus on fashion and textile history, and her master's degree in cultural heritage studies from University College London's Institute of Archaeology, where her research has focused on preservation in the face of increasing natural and man-made threats. And then we also have with Taylor, Lilith Guzman, who holds a dual Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies and Legal Studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and is currently enrolled at the University of Denver to obtain her Master of Arts in Global Environmental Sustainability. She has a diverse professional experience in environmental policy, education, and cultural heritage preservation. Currently, she's serving as a disaster fellow with the National Park Service under Taylor, and Lilith supports disaster recovery efforts through historic preservation grants and works with federal and state tribal partners. Her background includes research in climate change mitigation, sociology, and intersectional environmentalism. She's passionate about promoting sustainability and environmental justice through her work. So thank you both for being here. We look forward to your presentation. And so please take it away.
Thanks, Kara. And give me 1 second. Share my screen here. Go. All right. Look okay on everyone's screen? Good.
Looks good.
Good. Great. So, slide over here. So thank you and good afternoon, everybody. As Kara said, I'm Taylor Pearlstein. I'm a grant manager with the State, Tribal, Local Plans and Grants Division of the Park Service. We are primarily So we are part of the Cultural Resources Directorate of the Park Service, and we primarily manage the Historic Preservation Fund and the grant programs that are provided through it. Currently, I am the lead for our disaster program, and as Carrie mentioned, Lilith Guzman, who is our disaster program fellow, she'll be speaking a little bit about some of the projects and research that she has been doing with us as well. So kind of the main goal for today's presentation, I'll spend kind of the first half talking a little bit about some of the past and ongoing programs that we have through our disaster program to support recovery of resources impacted primarily by natural disasters. And then I'll spend kind of the second half talking through some of our other competitive grant programs and opportunities to kind of think about disaster planning in those contexts. Goes through. So our office manages approximately a dozen different grant programs at any given time. We have our annual grants that go to state and tribal historic preservation offices. We have about 8 competitive grant programs that are funded annually. The list here has been awarded pretty regularly over these last couple of years. And then we have our disaster grant programs, or ESHPF. But for the sake of brevity here, I'll just refer to it as our disaster program or disaster grants because it is quite a mouthful. So something that is kind of unique about our disaster grants. They run a little bit differently than a lot of our other programs in our office. More specifically, they're typically one-off appropriations for specific named storms following a disaster. So unfortunately, it's not funding that we necessarily have regularly from year to year. It's a little bit unpredictable in that way. But these are grants that go to assist disaster-affected states and tribes. More specifically, it's typically grants that go to the state and tribal historic preservation offices within areas with presidential disaster declarations or major disaster declarations. And then those state and tribal offices will either run in-house projects, contract projects, or award subgrants to, say, private property owners to do physical repairs and things like that. In terms of like recent history, typically they've been appropriated at $50 million for the program. And we had previous programs for Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, a program for Hurricane Sandy, and the 2 ongoing programs that we have right now, as Kara mentioned, are for Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and Florence, Michael, and Typhoon Yutu. I do want to caveat that information in saying that it doesn't have to be appropriated at $50 million, and it also doesn't have to be appropriated for hurricane recovery specifically. That is just what we have historically seen over these last couple of years. And I will add that it's a very, very political process. So I will leave that there, but just something to think about in terms of kind of how this program works right now. The funding can be used for staffing support for Section 106. So we certainly see that influx of Section 106 and compliance review that often comes with post-disaster recovery and federal agencies coming in to do those repairs. We also, of course, fund physical repairs of storm damage, so particularly to those private property owners, nonprofits, and folks at the local level. We can also fund survey and disaster planning. So even though the funds are kind of post-disaster and very much part of that long-term recovery phase and not necessarily preparedness or immediate response, we still try to incorporate elements of thinking about the future and how we can kind of take those steps through survey and identifying where things are. And similar to that mitigation, we do, particularly with our physical preservation projects, do try to enforce having some kind of mitigation component be a part of that project. Most recently, we did close out our Hurricane Sandy grants. And so over these last couple of years, we've been kind of working to kind of gather all the data from final reports from the states, including Delaware, and kind of synthesize that into a report out. So we're kind of in the final stages of that report. And so with that, I will pass it over to Lilith to talk a little bit more about it.
Thanks, Taylor. Hi, everyone. As Taylor mentioned, I'm Lilith. I'm the disaster fellow for the 24-25 year. And something that I've been working on as a fellow is the Sandy report. So it's kind of, as Taylor had mentioned, a compilation of all of the states that got some subgrants and some money towards them post Sandy. What that looks like, basically the purpose of the report is to gain a better understanding of SHPO and TIPO priorities and the long-term impact of this funding on these communities. So the report on disaster recovery funding post Sandy, just to see what historic preservation disaster management looked like. Recovery actions were taken by 14 different states, including Delaware, and tribal historic preservation offices as well. The Congress awarded 47 million in ESHPF funding to 12 of the most affected states and then 2 tribal nations. Over 98% of it was utilized. And most of the recovery projects, 65% of them were subgrant awardees by SHPOs and TIPOs on a competitive basis to eligible private, public, nonprofit, and commercial entities. So this sounds very abstract, but in our next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about those specific projects that were used specifically in Delaware and where that money went. So the National Park Service awarded Delaware $1 million in the state's Hurricane Disaster Relief Program for historic properties. In December 2013, that's when that money was awarded, and all of it was used up by February 1st, 2019. So it takes a little bit of time to spend all of that money, but the subgrants and the funds were expended as follows. We have the Milford New Century Club, about $50,000 was spent there. We have the Phillips Potato House, which was a really fun project, and there was some really fun pictures that came out of that. About $74,000 was spent there. And then the picture that you're currently looking at is the Harbor of Refuge Lighthouse. This is the damage after Sandy and then the post-repair completed using the subgrantee money, and there was about $782,000 that was used there. You're probably curious to know where the rest of that money went, and we actually used it for GIS mapping and data quality projects. So there was contractual staff, personnel costs and supplies, things like that. About $30,000 went there, and then seasonal staff personnel costs and about $17,000 went there. That last chunk of about $50,000 went to survey data and to surveying impacted areas within Delaware, see what it looked like before, during, and after the disaster of Sandy. And that's just kind of a very brief glimpse into what the Sandy report is. We did this for all 14 states mentioned, or 12, yeah, 14 states mentioned, and then the 2 TIPOs, the tribal states that also got funding through the Sandy spend outs. So that's just a little bit of a glimpse into it. And yeah, thank you, Taylor.
Thanks, Lilith. And I think, you know, seeing that kind of summary, even for the work that Delaware did, I think it is pretty representative of even sort of the projects that we're seeing now with our Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Florence, and kind of how a lot of the states are choosing to lay out their programs. Certainly spending a lot of money on, you know, additional supporting staff to really deal with that influx of projects, but also mapping and survey, and of course, those physical repairs. So in addition to those grants and subgrants that go to the state and tribal historic preservation offices, a major part of the work that we do with the disaster program is also technical assistance and partnering with other nonprofits and other federal agencies to develop other resources. Because the grants are so hyper-focused on the areas that have been impacted by those major disaster declarations, we've tried to create some other resources that, you know, will not only help those impacted communities, but still be resources with a bit more broader applicability. So one of those partners has been the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. More specifically, we partner with them to develop a disaster resiliency focused curriculum for their commission assistance and mentoring program, which is a training program that they run primarily for local historical commissions. So again, kind of focuses on resiliency and adaptation at that local level. We've also been working closely with them on developing CR Surveyor, which is our mobile survey app built on Esri's ArcGIS platform, more specifically built with field maps for those that might have some familiarity with that system. The photo here in the top left corner was us piloting the tool actually with the Puerto Rico State Historic Preservation Office, which was really cool to do with them. But essentially the tool is a mobile survey tool, so you can take your phone or tablet out on site and conduct surveys for architecture, archaeology, and we also have a quick post-disaster assessment tool. You can also kind of see from the screenshots here, but we do have both an English version and an English-Spanish bilingual version for use across different communities. Something that was very important to us in partnering with NEPC was creating and emphasizing the importance of survey and documentation. To protect the resources, you need to know what and where they are. And so this tool really makes that a little bit easier for folks to achieve. Some elements of it that are kind of interesting. You can also attach photos and different files in real time as you're conducting these surveys on site. You can also add multiple records to track the changes at the site over time, so you can kind of get a sense for how the conditions have changed at that site. And it can also be used without internet connection, which I know was a big thing, certainly post-disaster. So a map can be downloaded in advance, and then you can go and collect that data. And once you are back in network, it'll automatically sync that data to your account. And then all of that information kind of feeds into a dashboard where you can kind of review and visualize a lot of that information. I should add with this also, even though we've been kind of piloting this tool with primarily state historic preservation offices, the audience for this product really started at the local level, local government level. So again, the use is not specifically limited to any particular entity. So if it is something that you're interested in learning more about, I'm happy to share these slides so you can check out some of these links as well. We also partnered with the National Main Street Center, who developed a disaster and resilience toolkit. So this is primarily a toolkit focused on local leaders, local Main Street organizations, and how they can kind of plan for disaster risks, build resiliency, and kind of walks through steps for preparedness, response, and recovery for a historic downtown. It also has a lot of great resources for small business owners that might be working in those areas. So certainly check that out if you think that might be something that is a good fit. Another kind of outgrowth of some of the disaster program is our guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. I imagine some of this audience is probably very familiar with this document already. It's been out for a few years, but what I did want to encourage with this document is to definitely take advantage of the illustrated guidelines and the planning and assessment tool to not only get a better understanding of the different types of flood adaptation strategies that might be appropriate for the historic resources that you're managing, but also to think about how you might combine a lot of those different strategies into something that best fits your resource. And then the last resource I'll touch on very quickly, and kind of our newest one, is our before and after disasters guidance and checklist. This is a document that we put together along with FEMA, other federal, state, and tribal agencies. The audience for this document is primarily state or folks working at the state and tribal level, but it does a really good job generally just kind of walking through the national response and recovery frameworks. So even if you're not working at that state or tribal level and you're just trying to get a sense for kind of where historic and cultural resources fit into that broader framework, this can be a really good primer for that information, or even if you're just figuring out where to start. But as I said, the disaster funding itself and its availability is a little bit unpredictable, unfortunately. But I don't want that to necessarily discourage you from your efforts towards whether it's disaster planning, if you're in need of recovery funds from a different disaster that maybe didn't receive a major declaration, or if you're even just trying to address other climate risks for your building and collections. We talked about the funding right now being primarily focused on hurricane recovery, but there are certainly plenty of other natural disasters and plenty of buildings that need help. For this kind of second half of this presentation, I'm going to walk through a lot of our other competitive grant opportunities, but I want to talk a little bit about how you might still address climate and disaster related needs through those other programs. And we kind of often refer to it as creative funding, so to speak. So as I mentioned before, we do have our annual grants that go to state and tribal historic preservation offices. This includes 10% of funding from the state grants that is passed through directly to certified local governments, and which I do know Delaware has quite a few. But if you're not sure if you're in a certified local government or you're just interested in learning more about it, certainly check out our website or reach out to the Delaware State Office, and they can definitely talk about the program more with you. But one of the responsibilities of a certified local government is that they are required to help maintain a survey and inventory of historic properties. Again, to drive home, to protect resources, right? You need to know what they are and where they are. So a CLG grant in particular can be a really great way to do a survey project to improve those elements of preparedness, figure out where those resources that might be at higher risk for a particular climate threat, let's say, where those are located. And this is just one quick example. So following the forest fires near the city of Boulder in 2010, they really struggled because they realized that they didn't really know where a lot of their historic and cultural resources were. So when FEMA arrived, they weren't able to direct them to those places quickly. And so following that fire, they decided to apply for a CLG grant through the Boulder County CLG to conduct a survey, at least of those resources that ultimately did survive the fire. Unfortunately, that survey really did pay off. Just 3 years later, they dealt with some pretty severe flooding, likely in part as a result of those forest fires. But because they had conducted that survey, they were able to very quickly direct FEMA and other immediate stabilization resources to those places they had surveyed. And so you can see here, this church, they were able to get in and very quickly stabilize that building. In addition to our annual grants, we also have our 8 or so other competitive grants. I am going to try to run through these as quickly as I can because it's a lot of information. But again, I'm happy to share these slides and include links, and feel free to reach out or throw questions in the chat, and I'm happy to answer any of those. The first program I wanted to cover our Paul Brune Historic Revitalization grants. I wanted to cover these first because these are kind of the most similar, I would say, in terms of format to our disaster program, in that it's a block grant. So it funds a program that then makes subgrants for physical preservation, say at the local level. This grant is primarily focused on eligible sites in rural communities with a focus on encouraging economic development. Eligible applicants include state and tribal historic preservation offices, nonprofits, and CLGs. However, that's eligibility in terms of who is applying to us at the Park Service for that block grant. It's ultimately up to those grantees who they want to be eligible applicants for their subgrant program. So that could be nonprofits, that could be local governments or counties, it could be private property owners, which is pretty common, especially in those rural areas. So again, kind of similar to our disaster program in that way. No match is required for this program. The main requirement is that the funds must be spent in rural areas. So those are areas with fewer than 50,000 people as defined by the US Census. And I will also add that the next round of applications are expected to open in the next couple of weeks. So definitely keep your eye out for that. I will say this is definitely our most competitive grant, and it's not uncommon for folks to come in 1, 2, even 3 times before they get awarded one of these grants. But what I did want to emphasize in terms of its similarities to the disaster program is that we actually do have a pretty good example. We did award a grant just last year in Montana, where they are basically running a subgrant program to do repairs from the 2022 floods near Yellowstone. So they are essentially going to be running a subgrant program to award some of the buildings in their historic district that suffered damages from that flooding to do some of those repairs in that area. Something that's also kind of unique with the Paul Brune project is it's kind of on you as the primary grantee or recipient to kind of lay out what the theme is for your subgrant program and what the selection criteria will be. So it could be disaster or climate focused. We've had other programs where it was focused on historic theaters across the state, or even repairing historic facades in different rural towns across the country. So it is pretty varied, but that's also kind of part of what makes it so competitive. We also have our underrepresented communities grants. So these fund surveys of historic properties associated with underrepresented communities, as well as nominations to the National Register. Again, no match is required for this program. Current funding is dependent on Congress at the moment as far as that next round, but eligible applicants do include state and tribal historic preservation offices, CLGs, as well as nonprofits. This is also a really great place to start if you want to figure out where your underrepresented resources are. Again, you need to know where the resources are to protect them. We also have our African American Civil Rights Program. So these are grants to document, interpret, and preserve sites and stories related to African American civil rights. This does not have to just be 20th century history. This can go as far back as the transatlantic slave trade. So again, a pretty broad range of civil rights history. It can also be used for both physical preservation and history projects, including collections, and eligible applicants include states, tribes, local governments, and nonprofits. Eligible sites include those that are both listed and or eligible for the National Register, and that's something that you'll kind of see in a couple of these programs. In most cases, unless I kind of explicitly point out otherwise, the project doesn't necessarily have to be listed on the National Register at the time of application. If it's not currently listed, that can be part of your actual grant project, is to do that nomination writing or hire a consultant or contractor to do that nomination. In this case, it would need to ultimately be nominated for civil rights, or the nomination amended to include that civil rights history. Again, no match is required for this program, and we're still awaiting kind of next steps for the next funding cycle. But what I did want to emphasize with some of the projects in the photos here, so the project here is out in Galveston, Texas, Ashton Villa. This project in particular, they received a sub-grant from the disaster program through the Texas Historical Commission for Hurricane Harvey repairs. And ultimately what they determined was that they were going to need to elevate the building, which is very, very expensive to do. So essentially they decided to come in for an African American civil rights grant to supplement some of that work and kind of put it towards a phase 2 for that project. This particular building has historical associations with Juneteenth. So they're kind of doing the initial plans and specs through their disaster grant, and then they'll be spending a lot of their African American civil rights money on both the actual physical lift of the building, as well as amending the National Register nomination for this building to include more of that Juneteenth history. Another really great project, the photo here of Leona Tate being escorted to school in New Orleans. So Leona Tate was one of 3 girls that was escorted by U.S. federal marshals to McDonough 19 Elementary School. The school itself was closed shortly before Hurricane Katrina, and then that building was kind of left to deteriorate after the storm. A few years later, Leona Tate ultimately established a foundation and then decided through that foundation to basically rehabilitate this building. And the ultimate goal for the building was to reopen it as an interpretive space for learning about New Orleans civil rights history. So I really like this example. You know, they didn't necessarily receive disaster funding directly for Hurricane Katrina, but it's a really good example of still kind of working through those repairs and those the kind of recovery needs through a number of our other programs. And they've come in for several African American civil rights grants and a Save America's Treasures grant, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. So they're just a really great success story. We also have our History of Equal Rights grants. So these are grants to preserve sites related to all Americans' struggle for equal rights. These fund physical preservation projects, no match required. And as far as the definition of equal rights, it's kind of on the applicant to make that argument. So it doesn't need to be specific to any one group. It could be African American civil rights, but it could also be women's rights, LGBTQ+, disability rights and access, union rights. Again, up to the applicant to kind of make that case for that equal rights struggle. Eligible applicants include states, tribes, local governments, and nonprofits. And again, eligible sites are those that are both listed or eligible for listing for their association with equal rights. The project I have highlighted here as well, another great example, so Flora McDonald College in North Carolina, they initially received a subgrant award from the North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office for Hurricane Florence recovery. So that initial grant is essentially focused on roof repairs following the storm. They also received a FEMA grant to do some additional work with a different scope. but they realized it's a pretty large building and they needed a bit more funding. So they decided to apply and ultimately were awarded a History of Equal Rights grant to continue some of that preservation work. So that second grant is primarily working on window and masonry repairs. But the building itself was associated with early women's education. So it was a pretty easy fit into this program as well. But again, a good way to kind of mix different funding pots. We also have our semi-quincentennial grants. This is one of our newer programs. It is focused on preserving sites and structures that do have to be listed, not just eligible in the National Register, that commemorate the founding of the nation. We currently consider that founding of the nation deadline to be December 31st, 1800. So essentially the election of 1800 and that peaceful transfer of power. But the site doesn't necessarily have to be associated with colonial history or Revolutionary War history. It can be any site pre-1800. So it could even be pre-contact and indigenous history. It's a pretty broad range. Again, it's on you to kind of make that case. Eligible applicants do include states, tribes, local governments, and nonprofits, but I will add that we do give preference to state-owned properties. The grantee themselves doesn't necessarily have to be the state, but still a preference for those state-owned properties. And our next round of funding is anticipated in the next couple of weeks. And I'm sure there are a good few projects in Delaware that could certainly be eligible for this. So I definitely encourage you to take a look. We don't, again, this is a pretty new program, so we don't have a lot of progress photos at the moment. But I did want to highlight, we actually have one project that we just funded last year at the Historic Conference House on Staten Island. So they actually combine the semi-quincentennial grant along with a FEMA grant. So the FEMA grant is focused on conducting repairs to the roof of the building for specifically damage from Hurricane Ida. But in conjunction with that, they are in part using a semi-quin grant to do a feasibility study on mitigation techniques for the building structure. So it is a waterfront property and they're pretty regularly dealing with flooding and erosion. So they're kind of doing those projects in conjunction with each other. We also have our historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCU grants. So these are grants to assist HBCUs, in preserving National Register listed or eligible buildings on their campuses. It can also be used for planning as well as nominations. Again, no match required for this program. And we do anticipate the next round of applications to also be open in the next couple of weeks. We also have our Tribal Heritage Program. So these are grants to assist Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian communities in protecting and promoting cultural heritage and traditions. It can fund anything from oral histories to, complete physical preservation. Again, there's no match required for this program, and applications for this will also be opening towards the end of this year. While we don't necessarily have any current projects for HBCU or tribal heritage as far as having a specific disaster or climate focus. Again, I did want to emphasize that they're pretty broad in terms of the types of heritage or types of buildings that they cover. So even for something like HBCU, it might be a project where you're looking at the climate risks to a building on an HBCU campus. The program could be a way to approach those needed repairs or mitigation activities for a specific building or something like that. So I encourage the creativity. And then lastly, we have our Save America's Treasures grants, which folks might be probably the most familiar with this program. It's for the preservation and conservation of nationally significant buildings and collections. We manage it in partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts, Humanities, and Institute for Museum and Library Services. I will note that this program is a little bit different than our other programs. For one, the building or collection can only be funded once by an SAT grant. They can still come in for our other grants if they're applicable. Like I said, that project at McDonough 19 in New Orleans, they received the Save America's Treasures grant, but they've also been awarded 2 or 3 African-American civil rights grants at this point. And again, doing a great job. This program, again, also requires national significance. It doesn't necessarily have to be a national historic landmark, but for buildings, it does need to at least be listed for national significance in the National Register, not just listed in general. In the case of collections, which are obviously not being listed in the National Register, in those cases, you're essentially providing a description where you're making that justification for why that collection is nationally significant. So just a little bit different as far as the collection side. This is our only program that also does require 1-for-1 non-federal match, which is statutory. So again, just something to keep in mind. All right. And again, MPS essentially manages the building project side, and Institute of Museum and Library Services manages the collections projects. This program also just the most recent round of applications opened as of last week, and applications are due December 12th of this year. So if you are thinking about this program, I would start on that application tonight and get started, and let us know if you have any questions about that process. But again, just to kind of jump back here, the project that I've highlighted here, this is the Christiansted Old Barracks in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. So they received an SAT grant maybe a year or two ago. So we do have a disaster grant with the Virgin Islands for Hurricane Irma and Maria recovery, where they have been awarding subgrants. And some of those subgrants include many buildings that are surrounding this particular building, I will add. So this building ultimately did not apply for a subgrant with the Virgin Islands State Office, but at the same time, it was right in that area where they saw pretty severe damage from the hurricanes. And so a lot of the work that they'll be doing on this building will focus on hurricane recovery and rehabilitating that building. So again, different ways to kind of approach disaster recovery. All right. And then we do have a few other programs that I won't go into too much detail with, but if they do pique your interest, I have the link on here as well. And I know that was a lot of information and certainly a lot of things to kind of mull over. So I do encourage you to take a look at our website where you can also check out some examples of different preservation projects and get a sense for different things that we've funded in the past, get some inspiration, get some ideas, whether that's a disaster plan, design guidelines, a walking tour, whatever it might be. This is just a good place to kind of get some inspiration. So with that, I will wrap it up and leave some time for questions. I imagine there might be a good few of application questions. I also encourage you to sign up for our bulletin here. That's where we send our more immediate announcements when applications open. So I highly encourage you to do that. And if you do have any application questions, please reach out to us at our email listed here. I promise there are real people on the other side of that account, and they're happy to help you figure out the best next steps. But with that, maybe I'll leave this up if folks need the information, but I will stop talking.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And it'll be great if we could maybe share your presentation. There's so many resources that you went through that I think it'd be really helpful to have a kind of a go-to document for our attendees.
Absolutely.
Thank you both for your sharing this information. I think it's something that is definitely on our mind, especially, most recently Helene and all the destruction in Asheville. And I think it's interesting that there's kind of two halves to it, right? There's grants for the disaster post or post-disaster, cleanup and reconstruction and that. But then you are mentioning a lot of the pre-disaster mitigation and planning, which I think maybe gets forgotten about a little bit more. So I guess could you maybe speak a little bit more, or just kind of summarize, somebody who is in charge of a historic resource here, like what are some of the first steps that maybe they need to start considering as a precaution to, the next big natural disaster event? And what can they do with your program?
Sure. Like I said, survey and documentation is the most important tool here, even if you're not talking about a larger survey across a district or something like that, but even just documenting the condition of your building or your collections, the more photos, the better. And that not only applies to our grants, but that's going to be the key piece of applying for, insurance and FEMA and all of that. They're going to want to see those before and after photos and get a sense for what that damage is. So the more documentation, the more photos you have, the better shape you'll be in. So certainly, if that's something that you haven't quite done at this point, I would definitely encourage you to look at some of those programs focused on survey and documentation or some of those tools. Second piece of it, a lot of these programs, which I didn't touch on in as much detail, but again, I will absolutely share the slideshow. They do fund pre-preservation work too. So that planning stage, whether that's developing plans and specs or doing a historic structures report. And a lot of that can go towards figuring out what the risks to the building are. What are the priorities that you need to focus on? Do you need to pay attention to the leaking roof first? Do you need to do remediation first? What are kind of the highest priority needs in terms of sealing the building envelope and then going from there? And that also is a super helpful way to kind of frame your grant applications too, because then it kind of sets you up for success in terms of, what makes sense as a phase 1, a phase 2, and then you can kind of break that out for grant applications. And that's really helpful. So I'd say that's where I would probably start. Certainly, if you're dealing with flooding, I would definitely look at the flood guidelines as far as different adaptation strategies. Some are certainly a little bit more affordable than others and might be a better fit. But again, we know disaster is more than just flooding. So
Sure. But I think that is our primary concern here in Delaware. Just looking at the maps and where we're expecting to be in the next 20, 30 years. So definitely applicable. You mentioned that, you get this huge influx of applications after a disaster. Any tips that can set our applicants apart that can you give us the edge up?
So not necessarily an influx in terms of grant applications per se, but it's very common for especially people working at the state level to get pretty overwhelmed with compliance review for projects where federal agencies are required to do that review, and then they're submitting everything to that state agency. And that can be really hard to do without additional people and personnel. So that's why, part of the disaster grants, we often encourage the states, as part of setting up a successful program, is to hire more people and use some of that funding to hire folks. In terms of setting all of that up, again, very political process. There's a lot of lobbying involved that I cannot do. But certainly, post disaster, if there are things that you need, start with that state historic preservation office, let them know what you need, and they're very much sort of that liaison and the people that are going to kind of speak up and make those needs known to other agencies. But again, if it's not a major disaster declaration, it doesn't seem like there's something that might form into one of these other disaster programs, and you have a project that has some pretty immediate needs. Again, I would start with this slideshow, see what other programs it might be a good fit for, and definitely reach out to us and we can kind of talk you through what makes sense and what project ideas you might want to tackle.
That's great. So just want to give everybody a minute to just copy down your contact information. This is great. I think we don't have any more questions, but I just want to say thank you again, both Taylor and Lilith, for spending your time with us today and presenting to Preservation Delaware. We enjoyed having you.
Thank you. Yes, I know it's a lot of information to mull over, so if you think of questions later, we're available.
Thank you so much. And just so for our attendees, I just want to thank you for hanging out during this session. We have our last session next at 12:30. That will be what is new in the Delaware Preservation Fund, so some more grant topics, and presented by Kate Morrissey. So I'm going to say thank you guys again, and please stick around for our next session. Thanks, guys.